On the 5th of October 1915, my great-uncle, Lieutenant Aubrey Hastings of the 7th East Surrey Regiment, was killed in France, blown to pieces in his trench during the Battle of Loos. I grew up with his story, reading the unhappy letters that he wrote amid the poppies of the battlefield, along with those of a grandfather and another great-uncle who survived. But this is the first time I've visited the cemetery at Fouquier-la-Bethune, where Aubrey's buried, one of some 900,000 British Empire dead of the First World War. Almost everyone in this country shares such links with that catastrophe for our forefathers and for Europe. It's a funny business, looking down at the last resting place of one of my own family whom I never met, who died in a struggle that I've spent decades reading about. Its horror is not in doubt. But where I part company from what we might call the Blackadder take on history is to believe that it was also futile, that it didn't matter which side won. In the 21st century, the British people are deeply wedded to the idea that the Second World War was our good war, the first our bad one. But what if we'd stayed out? What if Germany had won? In my opinion, the deaths of Aubrey Hastings and hundreds of thousands of his comrades were assuredly a great tragedy, but they were not for nothing. Many British people honour the men who fought and died with a mixture of sorrow and a sense of waste. A belief that no cause could have justified so horrendous a sacrifice. But 100 years after the outbreak, it seems time to revisit the reasons we went to war in 1914. I want to argue that far from Britain having plunged into a bloodbath we could have stayed out of, our part in the First World War was tragically necessary. Any exploration of why Britain had to go to war in 1914 must start on the continent of Europe. The spark was ignited in the Balkans on the 28th of June when Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb, shot dead Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne. The empire's rulers immediately determined to exploit the outrage to justify invading neighbouring Serbia, where the murder weapons had come from. But the Russians were Serbia's close allies, and they made it plain they would fight to protect their fellow Slavs. Through July 1914, the great continental powers waded ever deeper into crisis. But from the outset, the key player was Germany. On the 6th of July, its rulers pledged the Austrians their unconditional support to smash Serbia, promising to deal with Russia and its own ally France if they intervened. Day by day, it became plainer that none of the big players would back down. And thus began the countdown to the First World War. Some historians have argued that once it became clear that Austria and Germany were going to war with France and Russia, we, the British, should simply have left them to get on with it, stayed out. That all that would have come out of a German victory was a fast-forwarded version of today's European Union. I don't buy that. The people who were running Germany cared nothing for democracy or other people's freedoms. Once the shooting started, it became plain that their war aims were little different from those of Hitler 35 years later, excepting only the Jewish genocide. The causes of the war are hugely complicated, with the death of the Archduke only setting in motion existing forces. No one nation deserves all the blame. But there's an overriding case that German recklessness contributed more than anything else to make a conflict intended to settle a local score escalate into a European war. And once the fighting and dying started, it became cruelly apparent that a German victory would be a disaster for Europe. In 1914, Germany was by far the most powerful state on the continent, the most advanced society in Europe. Industrially, it was racing ahead of its rivals in every field from pharmaceuticals to automobile design. Socially, it pioneered a welfare state by creating unemployment insurance and old age pensions. German culture was revered across the world. But it became Europe's historic tragedy that the German system of government lagged generations behind everything else in the country. The Empire's elected parliament had the largest socialist party in Europe. But while the Reichstag dominated domestic affairs, it was the Kaiser, the so-called All-Highest, Wilhelm II, who still made every key appointment and controlled decisions about war and peace. Wilhelm was a weak man who sought to masquerade as a strong one, chronically unstable and prone to violent mood swings. He wasn't at heart a warmonger, as of course Hitler was, but he loved to play at soldiers. He offered threats and blandishments to other powers, which he always got in the wrong order. Professor John Roll has spent a lifetime studying and writing about the Kaiser. How personally influential was Kaiser Wilhelm in the decision for war?
Kaiser Wilhelm took over the reins from his father in 1888 and inherited Bismarck's immense power himself when he threw Bismarck out. But not content with that, he then went back to an almost 18th century notion of monarchy. In other words, he insisted on ruling personally. With the result, he appointed all ministers, all the chancellors, all the generals, all the admirals, himself personally, according to his likes and dislikes. He was an extremely assertive bully.
Well, it was just an extraordinary situation that you had a socialist majority, violently anti-militarist majority in the Reichstag, and yet exercising no influence at all, really, over this regime and foreign policy.
Yeah. One of the reasons, I believe, behind the German general's decision to go to war around about 1914 was the rising tide of democracy at home. The thinking was, well, if we leave it too long, we will not be able to get our way and do what we really need to do to make Germany great. So we better go before that time comes.
The most powerful institution in Wilhelm's empire, and indeed in all continental Europe, was the German army. The Kaiser was also eager to extend his power across the seas and personally promoted the creation of a big-gun navy. This thoroughly alarmed the British, who feared Germany's fleet as a threat to their global trade routes and empire. As Queen Victoria's grandson, Wilhelm retained some respect for her people, but he was determined that neither he nor his empire should defer to them.
It's almost as if he feels obliged to be more military and more masculine than any other monarch, perhaps because there's always the whiff of Englishness about him, his mother being English. He was always very keen to say, no, I'm not English, I'm Prussian, I'm extremely Prussian. So there's this autocratic side to him, there's extreme militarism, but some of it does come from England. So, for example, the love of the Navy, the idea that he has a mission to become the superpower in Europe in place of Britain. He feels he has a right as leader of this new, energized Germany after unification.
fear of Germany's might and of its aspirations to dominate Europe prompted Russia and France to forge a close military alliance. Although Britain's government made no firm written commitment, it posted an option on supporting them in the event of war. Many British people recoiled from the idea of joining an alliance with Tsar Nicholas II, whose people had been Britain's enemies through the 19th century. But the fears of Europe's rulers that a general war would result from their rivalries caused every nation to huddle close to its friends. The Germans to the Austrians, the Russians to the French, with the British as cautious maybes. Germany's warlords were haunted by fears of Russia's growing might. Some of them were convinced that challenging the Tsar's armies sooner rather than later offered Germany the best chance of victory. This is one of many German memorials to Prussia's 19th century military triumphs. Instead of perceiving big wars, as we do today, as universal tragedies, the Kaiser's generals, and sometimes Wilhelm himself, believed that trial by battle was an acceptable instrument of policy. All Germany's leaders were insecure, even paranoid, about threats at home from the socialists, abroad from Russia and France, probably backed in a showdown by Britain. In those days, not many people thought seriously about economics. The Kaiser and his generals counted soldiers. They failed to realize that their country was achieving dominance of Europe without firing a shot through its industrial power. By 1914, so many Germans had come to believe that a European clash in arms was inevitable, that their fatalism contributed mightily to bringing this about. The Kaiser, who was almost certainly clinically unstable, was one of 3 men in Germany who took the key decisions which resulted in war. To this day, historians argue fiercely about which pulled the levers to precipitate disaster. The others were the Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, appointed by Wilhelm, and General Helmut von Moltke, head of the army. The Kaiser and the Chancellor were the ones who, on the 6th of July, promised Austria Germany's support against Serbia. Bethmann-Hollweg, knowing that Russia was committed to protect the Serbs, pressed the Austrians to hurry their invasion to preempt the Tsar. This has become known as Berlin's blank check, keystone of the argument that Germany was most blameworthy for the horrors that followed. Professor Sir Hugh Strawn has been studying and chronicling the war for over 30 years. He agrees that Berlin took a huge gamble. The Germans actively encouraged the Austrians not merely to invade Serbia, but to get on and do it even more quickly than they were ready to do it.
Yes, partly because I think if they do it quickly, you'll get away with it. You'll be able to crush Serbia. There'll be a Balkan war that is over so quick that nobody will have time to intervene. So the presumption here is speed. And what Berlin is doing is constantly taking best-case advice. You know, will Russia stay out of this war because they're worried there'll be a revolution in Russia? The best answer is that yes, they will, because there has been a revolution in Russia in 1905, and there might be again. So they work with that assumption, whereas in fact, of course, the Tsar is going to be put under tremendous pressure to back South Slavs in Serbia.
But throughout July, the one nation, surely, that had the power to stop this process, if the Germans had said to the Austrians, stop, do not invade Serbia, there would have not been a general European war, would there?
That's right. I think they have the power to say no. I mean, after all, the blank check is central, and the blank check is issued by Germany. And Germany then seems to show remarkable insouciance as to how that check will be used. You know, Austria-Hungary still has to cash it. It's Austria-Hungary that has to initiate war. But absolutely, the balance then shifts to Berlin. And if any power has the capacity to stop it, it's Berlin, particularly at the very end of the crisis.
Army Chief of Staff Helmut von Moltke, who answered only to the Kaiser, also played a pivotal role. On the 28th of July, Wilhelm and Bethmann-Hollweg experienced a brief panic attack, The looming war now looked far bigger and graver than they'd bargained for. But Moltke, on his own initiative, telegraphed the Austrians and urged them to hasten their attack. The Chief of Staff had long argued that if Germany must face a European showdown, it was better to have it before the Russians' big armaments expansion program was complete. At an Imperial Council meeting in December 1912, he's reliably reported as saying, "War, and the sooner the better." Annika Mombauer is a German scholar who's written a biography of the Chief of Staff which emphasizes his role in the July crisis. Where did Moltke fit into the decision for war?
Well, Moltke very much advocates war. He thinks that war is inevitable in the long run. He thinks that eventually Russia will become too strong, too militarily powerful for Germany to defeat her, and therefore he creates an atmosphere in which war seems a good solution out of a perceived problem.
One thing that seems extraordinary to us about how dysfunctional the German government was in July 1914 is that here you've got Moltke, who's supposed to be just the head of the army, and at a critical moment, July the 28th, he sends a telegram to Vienna, to the Austrians, telling them to get on with invading Serbia. And it does seem an extraordinary reflection of both how reckless Moltke could be and of how powerful he was.
Well, you're right. He does send that telegram, and in Vienna they end up saying, well, who
Who rules in Berlin?
Who rules in Berlin? Moltke or Bethmann? Or was it, in fact, the Kaiser? So yes, you're completely right. He exceeds his authority, if you like, by sending this telegram.
Germany's leadership in July 1914 was extraordinarily reckless in accepting the risk that by promoting a small Balkan war, they would trigger a huge European one. When it became plain that the Russians would fight rather than see Serbia go under, the Germans refused to take the one step that could have prevented a general European catastrophe, telling the Austrians to pull back. Instead, they themselves prepared to mobilize against Russia. And that's why I believe they deserve most blame for all that followed. On the 28th of July, Austria declared war on Serbia, and 2 days later, the Tsar ordered his army to mobilize. Germany then issued two ultimatums, one to Russia and another to France, its ally. Neither was expected to accept, and few of the Kaiser's generals wished them to. Berlin then set in motion its hugely ambitious war plan, designed to crush France before turning on Russia. Created almost a decade earlier by Moltke's predecessor, Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the plan required an invasion of France by way of its back door, through neutral Belgium. It was the German commitment to overrun Belgium which suddenly propelled Britain, hitherto a mere spectator of the continental drama, to the forefront of the stage. Under a treaty signed in 1839, this country was among the guarantors of Belgian neutrality. I'm one of those who still wonder whether Britain really would have come in if it hadn't been for the invasion of Belgium. Moltke got this dead wrong, didn't he?
He did. He was in an impossible situation, militarily speaking or strategically speaking, because Germany is, in a sense, encircled by France in the west and Russia in the east. And the only way he thinks he can win this war is by implementing the so-called Schlieffen Plan. And that plan can only work if France is defeated quickly, and that means invading Belgium. But interestingly, in France, the Chief of Staff similarly thinks our best chance would be to advance through Belgium, but the politicians, the diplomats, tell him we can't do that because of Britain.
The British told France, on no account, going to Belgium.
Exactly. And so had Germany also respected Belgian neutrality, there would have been all sorts of possibilities right at the end of July and early in August, perhaps to come to a different outcome.
Thus, in the first days of August 1914, Germany prepared to invade and crush France in a campaign of 40 days before turning on Russia. Europe had a war, but must the British be in it? Would they fight? Basking in the balmy summer of 1914, and preoccupied by industrial turmoil and threatened Irish civil war, the British people had scant appetite for a continental conflict. But Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and several key cabinet colleagues were appalled by the prospect of Germany achieving dominance of Europe. They doubted that Britain could merely remain a bystander while this happened. One such was the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, who played a critical role. Sir Edward Grey is traditionally seen as a reticent English gentleman whose grand passions were fly fishing and bird watching, both of which he wrote good books about. But more recently, he's become a focus of fierce controversy. Some historians claim that Grey made rash, secret commitments to the French which dragged us unnecessarily into war. For centuries, it had been a British article of faith that a balance of power, which denied absolute dominance to any one nation, must be maintained on the continent. Between 1908 and 1914, when Grey was not casting a fly on bright waters, he held secret talks with the French about British support in the event of a German attack. The Foreign Secretary was less clever and less of a statesman than his admirers thought. But the claim that he should be damned for dragging Britain into an unnecessary war doesn't stand up. I suggest that Grey was a realist about the difficulty, indeed impossibility, of Britain simply standing by doing nothing while Germany conquered Europe. If the French and Russians had been beaten, as they almost certainly would have been if Britain hadn't come in, who can imagine a victorious Germany allowing Britain to continue ruling the waves and the world's financial system any more than Hitler would have done if Churchill had tried to strike a deal with him in 1940? Nothing Grey said beforehand could have deterred the Germans, because they had weighed Britain's military power and discounted it. The little British army seemed incapable of influencing a huge clash of continental hosts. The Royal Navy was thought irrelevant because, in the Kaiser's scornful words, dreadnoughts have no wheels. The Foreign Secretary's secret and unwritten assurances to France seem to me to have reflected not warmongering but prudent and essential precaution. In July 1914, by proposing an immediate European conference, Grey did all that he could to avert war. Sir Michael Howard is Britain's most distinguished living historian. He and I have spent many hours discussing the vast puzzle of 1914 and, crucially, whether Britain could have done more to avert disaster. Grey's proposal, which they rejected out of hand, to address the confrontation between Austria-Hungary and Serbia by having a peace conference, it wasn't a contemptible proposal, was it? If they wanted a diplomatic outcome.
I mean, it was absolutely typical Grey thing to do, a typical sort of liberal solution. And
the Germans rejected it flatly.
The Germans rejected it flatly because this would have meant letting down the Austrians, and they were not going to let down the Austrians. There was this sense throughout all classes in Austria, it is time to finish with the Serbs. If we don't finish with the Serbs, they will nibble us to death. This is the moment to strike. The Germans, knowing this was the case, were not going to bring in the Austrians to debate about what their future was going to be. So to that extent also, you could say that the Germans were responsible for not letting there be a peaceful settlement.
On the 2nd of August, the Germans issued an ultimatum to King Albert of Belgium demanding passage for their armies. He flatly refused and appealed to Britain as a guarantor of his country's neutrality. Thus it fell to Sir Edward Grey to convince a still reluctant British Parliament of the necessity for Britain to join the war on the continent. On the afternoon of the 3rd of August, Grey delivered the most important speech of his life to the House of Commons. By now, most of the cabinet believed that Britain must fight in the name of Belgium's rights. Could this country, Grey demanded, stand by and watch the direst crime that ever stained human history and thus become participators in the sin? He added, "We should, I believe, sacrifice our respect and good name before the world and should not escape the most serious and grave consequences." This was one of those extraordinary parliamentary occasions that changed history. It persuaded much of the Liberal Party, hitherto bitterly hostile to intervention, now to support it, as the Conservative opposition already did. Thus, on the 4th of August 1914, after Berlin rejected an ultimatum demanding its withdrawal from Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. Was Belgium the real reason that Britain went to war in 1914, or as some historians nowadays try to argue, oh, it was just a pretext that the British government really wanted to fight anyway?
Yeah. Well, I would tend to say it's both and. There are two arguments here. One is the security of Belgium and the absence of a dominant power on the mainland of Europe is seen as central to Britain's strategic position. There can't be the equivalent of Napoleon facing Britain across the Channel and dominating Britain's routes to the rest of the world. The second issue is, does it matter that Germany disregards its international obligations, enters Belgium, which is a neutral state, and fails to reflect both international law and the rights of small nations? And the answer is it does matter. And it matters because for Britain, international law and what we might now see as morality also matters. But it's more fundamental than that. Because Britain is an economic power, a trading power, a power that depends on its shipping, actually, international law is more than just a sense of legal and moral obligation. It's also a matter of economic necessity. You need to respect international law to make sure that Britain can continue to exercise the degree of leverage it does as a neutral itself.
Well, some people say now, oh, it was incredibly silly for Britain to get involved in this horrific experience, the First World War, just because the German army marched into Belgium. But actually, it seems to me, it was a pretty good reason for going to war.
It was an excellent reason for going to war, and it did something which, at the beginning of the July crisis, seemed unimaginable to many.
United the British people.
It united the British people. It united the cabinet and united the people.
As Britain mobilised its little army in that first week of August, Germany's vast host was already surging into Belgium. Within days, the first reports appeared in the world's newspapers describing the extraordinarily brutal conduct of German troops towards the Belgian people. They were not merely carelessly destroying homes and villages. All invading armies do that. They were seizing and killing civilian hostages in scores and hundreds. Even before 1914, the Kaiser's army had earned a reputation for exceptional brutality. Between 1904 and 7, when the Herero and Nama tribes rebelled against German colonial rule in southwest Africa, the Kaiser's soldiers killed or deliberately starved to death almost 100,000 native people. Wilhelm applauded and decorated the officer responsible. Even by the imperial standards of the day, this action was worse than any British excess. But the Herero genocide had been far away in Africa. In August 1914, world opinion was stunned by German savagery towards fellow Europeans. In Flanders, the destruction of the medieval university town of Louvain, today rebuilt from ashes, became a symbol of the excesses of the Kaiser's soldiers endorsed by Berlin. Professor John Horn has exhaustively researched and catalogued the German army's actions in Berlin and France during 1914. John, we're here in the University Library at Louvain. What happened here?
Well, on the 25th of August, there was the sound of fighting, German soldiers shooting at what they claimed was a civilian insurrection. Round about 11 o'clock in the evening, this beautiful university library was broken into by the German soldiers and deliberately set fire. One young Jesuit, Father Dupérieux, had written in his notebook that he thought the Germans, in burning down the library, had done something as barbaric as the destruction of the Library of Alexandria in antiquity. This was seized by German soldiers and he was summarily executed. And by the 29th or the 30th, you have to imagine Louvain as an almost empty town. The population that hadn't been deported gradually straggled back in to find between 1,500 and 2,000 buildings destroyed, and well over 240 of their own townspeople had been killed.
All armies in all wars can behave very badly. What seems different about what happened in Belgium in 1914 was that it wasn't just a question of the odd soldiers brutally murdering a few civilians. They were systematically shooting them in scores and sometimes in hundreds as hostages.
You're quite right, but what we've just described in Louvain was a terrible incident, and it immediately grabbed the international headlines. But it was typical of something that happened across the whole invasion front in Belgium and also in eastern France. And it wasn't the worst case in terms of the death rate. Dinant was destroyed as a town and 674 of its inhabitants executed 2 days before.
In cold blood?
In cold blood.
In the first weeks of the war, nearly 6,500 civilians were executed by German troops in Belgium and France. Berlin claimed that they were merely exacting legitimate reprisals for resistance by civilians, so-called francs-tireurs. But John Horn rejects this. You found no evidence at all of franc-tireur activity, did you, of guerrilla activity against the Germans?
None. It was, apart from the odd, very isolated incident, but nothing which justified the German accusations, which was that there had been what they called a Volkskrieg, a people's war, a mass uprising. And the Kaiser, already by the 9th of August, only a week into the war, is accusing the King of the Belgians of fomenting such an uprising. It didn't happen.
It was the institutional response of the German generals and right up to the Kaiser that seemed striking, and it does seem to say something about the character of the regime.
That's right, because very quickly, what starts out as panics and localized responses by German soldiers is immediately endorsed by the whole German command structure. And then what swings into play is a series of very brutal reprisals, which are justified in terms of German military doctrine as to what you do when you're faced with civilian uprising.
For years, apologists for Germany claimed that the Belgian atrocities were figments of Allied propaganda. Some of the stories that made headlines in 1914, for instance, claims that thousands of babies were maimed by German soldiers, were indeed fabrications. But a big truth persists. The German army behaved with systemic barbarity during its advance across Belgium and France. Its actions persuaded many hitherto doubting British people that they had chosen the right side in the ghastly conflict that was unfolding. Some historians today claim that the British government's decision to go to war in defence of Belgium's neutrality was simply a fig leaf, a pretense, when really it was all simply about supporting the French against the Germans. I'd put it a bit differently. Yes, it's true that some key ministers wanted to fight anyway. But Belgium provided a tipping point. All sorts of British people who cared nothing for Serbia or Russia could easily get their minds around the notion that it was outrageous that the most powerful army in Europe proposed to crush beneath its boots a small state simply to serve the convenience of the Schlieffen Plan. And wasn't that indeed a decent and honourable reason for Britain to go to war? Had Germany been victorious on the continent, Britain would have found itself in a desperate and lonely predicament.
If the Germans had won, and now I hypothesize, there would have been an Anglo-German war within a matter of years. The fear in Britain was that a power which unified the continent would then be in a position to challenge Britain's command of the sea. If she challenged and successfully overturned Britain's command of the sea, not only would we no longer have an empire, we would be at the mercy of whoever commanded the whole of Europe. That was what the British feared. That was what...
And they were right to fear it.
And they were right to fear it because there was a substantial element in Germany, led by the Kaiser, whose one objective was to challenge Britain as a world power, to build a great navy which could then defeat the British, and Germany would then become a world power at the expense of the British. So if the Germans had won the war, I see no way in which they would not have used their dominance of Europe to bring the British down. So we would not have avoided a war, we would only have postponed one.
By early September, the German army had swept through Belgium and into France. With Berlin believing that its victory was imminent, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg drew up a list of his country's demands at the peace talks. They included seizing large swathes of land from both France and Russia, annexing Luxembourg, making Belgium and Holland vassal states. The September Plan, as it became known, was designed to secure Germany's absolute political and economic control of Europe. But in the second week of September, the French army achieved a historic victory in the Battle of the Marne, driving back the Germans from the gates of Paris. What followed in the autumn of 1914 finally wrecked Germany's dream of swift victory. It also witnessed the first big and seriously bloody battle of the war for the British. In October, the British Expeditionary Force marched towards the old Belgian cloth town of Ypres, Wipers, as millions of British soldiers came to know it. They arrived there just in time to clash head-on with a massive enemy offensive, the last great German effort to win the war by Christmas. What took place in the 5 weeks of battle around Ypres set the pattern for the vision of the First World War, which has been etched into our national culture ever since. Former soldier Clive Harris today guides visitors to the battlefields of the First World War, and especially those around Ypres.
But you can see it's shell-torn.
He's brought me to Polygon Wood, one of the most famous or notorious landmarks of the desperate struggle in 1914.
It's right at the edge of the Menin Road, which runs back towards Ypres, which is about 5-6 kilometres behind us now. It sits right at the centre of the battlefield as well. So from the moment the Germans attack us on the 18th of October, right through to the last knock-ins of First Ypres on the 11th of November, this wood here and the two woods just to the rear of us were key as part of the battlefield.
This is where the Germans made their last huge push of 1914 to try and win the war before Christmas.
They did, yeah. They now realised that they needed to knock us out of the war, and by doing so they needed to capture the Channel ports, and therefore they moved away from the von Schlieffen Plan to a degree, and the capture of Ypres. This is the last thing. Other side of Ypres, there is no defences. It was our last chance. There is nothing behind us but the Channel ports.
And there were battles all over the shop, small battles all over the wood here.
They were, yeah. We tend to think that the British line would be a continual line, when in fact it was more a series of outposts, and quite often units found themselves isolated and having to make small unit charges into Germans as opposed to a larger cohesive defence.
Here in western Belgium, the war of manoeuvre, ranging across thousands of square miles that had been waged through the late summer of 1914, gave way to a stalemate across the Western Front. The technology of defence and destruction, artillery and machine guns, had achieved a dominance which confounded the generals of both sides. At Ypres, cavalrymen saw their horses almost for the last time before being obliged to join a death grapple on foot.
Well, we're here. This is the site of the Horse Guards Memorial, and it marks an area where the Horse Guards fight as infantry pretty much on this spot. We're just on the...
So they came charging up, dismounted.
Yeah, initially
and were
by
pushed
horseback.
into
This actual spot's where one of the machine gun positions, because it gives us a great arc of fire over advancing enemy.
But what seems important here, Clive, it wasn't just that the British threw back the German army, it was also that the whole character of the war changed for all the armies, that here was where they first came to terms with what everybody now understands as the full horror of the Great War, wasn't it?
Yeah, trench warfare, and this is the end of that war of movement that starts in the August, all the way down to the Marne, all the way back again, and it's here that we start to dig. So, yeah, we're on the spot where it changes.
And when it started to rain,
Yeah.
they weren't in the earth, they were in the mud.
Yeah, then you have to learn to cope with things such as trench foot and how to get around that and reinforce your trenches to withstand bombardments. We're no longer going to see artillery now in front of the infantry firing as field guns. They're going to be behind the lines or certainly in sunken lanes and that sort of thing.
And nobody dares show his head above the parapet.
No, we go subterranean from now on, that's right. Any movement by day would have been suicidal, yeah.
But the British paid a devastating price for their narrow victory at Ypres. 56,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in a month. The old professional British Army was largely destroyed. Thereafter, it would be civilian volunteers and later conscripts who accounted for the overwhelming majority of the 6 million British soldiers who eventually served. But however terrible the sacrifice, it seems mistaken to imagine that there was ever an easy means by which the war could have been ended.
Gentlemen, our long wait is nearly at an end. Tomorrow morning, General Insanity Melchett invites you to a mass slaughter. We're going over the top.
Well, huzzah and hurrah!
The hugely successful Blackadder series epitomises the enduring popular view of the First World War, that the British Army fell victim to idiot commanders devoid of brains or courage.
Well, best of luck to you all. Sorry I can't be with you, but obviously there's no place at the front for an old general with a dicky heart and a wooden bladder.
Well, chuff then. See you all in Berlin for coffee and cake.
Most of the war's commanders really were pretty unlovable and unimaginative men. But once the most powerful industrial states in Europe were locked in strife, it seems wrong to imagine that even a Wellington or Napoleon could have found an easy road to victory. George Orwell wrote a generation later that the only way to end a war quickly is to lose it. He was right. The trench stalemate on the Western Front posed intractable problems which no commander proved able to solve. Generals needed to be able to control their forces by telephone and could only do so from behind the front rather than at the head of their troops as on history's battlefields. But the price of long-distance command was to create a divide between the top brass in their chateaus and their men calf-deep in mud, which has made an enduring and bitter impact on posterity's view of the war. In the summer of 1918, Allied forces finally broke the stalemate on the Western Front and pushed east across France, with the British Army taking more prisoners than all their Allied partners put together. The Germans, exhausted and demoralized, fell back in growing disarray until an armistice was signed on the 11th of November. Around 10 million combatants, 900,000 of them from the British Empire, had lost their lives. 2 months after the shooting stopped, the victorious Allies convened a peace conference at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. Their task was enormous, their purposes the most ambitious in history. The Versailles summit has often since been branded a failure which condemned Europe to a further generation of strife. Prime Minister Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and American President Woodrow Wilson led the negotiations involving delegations from many other interested nations, which lasted for 6 months between January and June 1919. Their intention was to produce a treaty that would not only reshape Europe, but also ensure that there could never again be a great war by disarming the Germans and making them pay the costs of the conflict. Historian Margaret Macmillan is the author of the most compelling and vivid modern narrative of what happened at Versailles. What was at stake for the Allied powers at Versailles?
I think they had two things they had to think about. They were deeply concerned about the state of Europe, and indeed their own countries included. There was real fear of revolution, and they were worried that the situation might deteriorate. What was also at stake, of course, is they were democracies, and they had to think of their publics. And the publics had been led to believe, and had been kept going in the war by the promise that it was going to make a much better world. And so what they had to try and do is create a better world to appease.
Incredibly ambitious objectives.
It's very ambitious, but then, of course, the First World War is so unusual compared to earlier wars because it was so exhausting that you couldn't just say at the end of it, well, that's it, done, we'll make a few border changes and we'll go back to normal. You couldn't go back to normal.
I seem to remember that the Germans eventually paid less than they had made the French pay after they beat the French in 1871.
But what the Allies couldn't say to their own people was, look, there's no way Germany can pay what really we need to rebuild, because their own people had suffered so much, and so they had to put a bill in. But what they did was they fudged it. They divided the total reparations bill up, so the Germans only paid a fraction. Once they'd paid the fraction, they'd pay the rest, which of course the Germans never wanted to do.
The Allies really failed afterwards to convince their own peoples that their cause had been just, didn't they?
Well, I suppose the problem with the First World War is that the expectations are so high, the promises are so great, and all sorts of promises, as we know, are made during the war to try and keep people in the war. But there's no way that all those promises can be cashed in after the war is over.
Abuse fell upon the Versailles Treaty almost before ink was dry on the signatures. The economist John Maynard Keynes, one of the British Treasury delegation, published a scathing broadside entitled "The Economic Consequences of the Peace." A strong German sympathizer, Keynes made a case that the terms imposed upon Germany were both morally unjust and economically foolish. How influential was Maynard Keynes in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which absolutely damned Versailles?
It was very influential. I mean, he wrote it very quickly. It became a bestseller immediately. It's been in print ever since. And it's a brilliant polemic. It's not fair. He paints this picture of these greedy, selfish, hard-hearted, cynical men dividing up Europe, punishing Germany, and they're just making a complete mess of it. I think there's also, he represents a whole generation of younger people who had supported the war, believing that the world was going to be a better place, and when they saw it wasn't going to be, they reacted and blamed the people who were trying to make peace for everything.
I would have thought one of the huge unfairnesses of Keynes' book is that he never set it in the context of saying, all right, even if the Allies have made a fumbled, bungled peace, if the Germans had won, and if the Germans had been making the peace, it would have been a vastly crueler and worse one for Europe.
Well, I think there's plenty of evidence that what the German High Command, and they were basically in control of Germany by this point. By 1918, you had a military dictatorship in Germany. And what they were planning were pretty extensive annexations of other people's lands in the West. And in the East, they were planning to extend their influence. In the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, they had forced the Bolsheviks, who were desperate, to give over whatever gold they had left. They'd set up an independent Ukraine. I mean, the evidence is, unless they'd had a complete change of heart, it would have been a very harsh peace.
Today, an awful lot of people have come to feel a real guilt about the Treaty of Versailles. Oh, it was an unfair treaty to Germany, that it contributed to the rise of Hitler. It got it wrong. Was it the harsh, vindictive treaty they claim?
The trouble with the treaty, I think, is that it appeared to be harsher than it actually was. And of course, it was all about implementation. And in the end, most of those clauses which limited German power and forced Germany to pay reparations were not really implemented fully. And so I think there's a perception of the treaty as very harsh. My question always is what would you have done otherwise? How would you have treated Germany if you felt it had caused the war and caused this catastrophe for Europe? What would you have done? Wouldn't you have tried to limit its power?
Because Versailles failed to deliver a lasting peace, it has become unjustly blamed for the fact that a Second World War had to be fought. In truth, so many violent forces and crises shook Europe between 1919 and 1939 that it seems absurd to blame the peacemakers for having failed in their grand purposes. In the decade following Versailles, all Europe groaned under the burden of paying the bills for the past conflict. Britain was almost bankrupt, and the moral and political regeneration which Prime Minister Lloyd George had repeatedly promised failed to happen. Many men came back from the army to find their old jobs taken by civilians, often women. Whereas in 1945, veterans returned to a country run by a Labour government committed to creating a welfare state, after 1918, the old gang remained in charge of an unreformed British society. Those who had fought felt that they had been sold a false bill of goods. My own grandfather, a writer who won a military cross as a gunner officer in France, became one of those who, within a few years of the armistice, asked himself what it had all been for. Here's an essay my grandfather wrote for a literary magazine in 1923 after meeting a group of fellow veterans who'd served with him in France. They now felt, he said, that they had gone, not as heroes, but on a fool's errand, to fight in a war that was not worth fighting. They'd endured the unsightly, dirty life of the battlefields with a cheery and modest sense of merit, with a belief that they were making some contribution to a good cause. But now, it transpired, this had been a stupid article of faith, which was exploded. My grandfather and his kind felt themselves strangers in a strange land, divided by the horrendous trench experience from those at home who knew almost nothing about it. The poets of the Western Front, such men as Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, Siegfried Sassoon, vividly described its horrors and the sense of military futility in a fashion that later generations have found irresistible. Here was the world's worst wound, and here with pride their name liveth for evermore, the Gateway claims. Was ever an immolation so belied as these intolerably nameless names? Well might the dead who struggled in the slime rise and deride this sepulchre of crime. But Sassoon and his kind never addressed the huge question of how on earth Britain could have escaped from the war except by conceding defeat. It's a weird British thing that while we're hugely proud that our forefathers fought Hitler, we seem almost ashamed that they fought the Kaiser. How has the overwhelming perception developed in Britain over the last 100 years that there was nothing worth fighting about in the First World War?
Well, the interesting point is not so much that after the war opinion changed or opinion veered to the point when it said that was a bad war, it was badly conducted, it was a waste of time and a waste of blood, and it should never have happened. Nobody thought that in 1918. I think nobody thought that for another 10 years, until about 1928 and 1930.
The poets did.
The poets did, but the interesting thing is whether people would have been interested and affected by what the poets wrote. They became expressive of a public opinion in 1928. They weren't expressive in 1918. By the end of the 1920s, there's this worldwide slump. Total catastrophic unemployment everywhere, especially in Germany. The situation seemed to be far worse in 1928 than it had been in 1914. And by 1933 or so, it has become generally accepted that the war was an unnecessary war, that it had been bungled, etc., etc. So I think that what was very, very important was not so much the fact that the war had been terribly expensive and bloody and the losses were awful. It was that nothing seemed to have come out of it of any good.
Europe's descent into the turmoil and privations of the 1930s caused many people to view the Great War as bungled, the peace shambolic. Some perversely blamed the victors for the rise of Hitler and Nazism. While many people today still think of the First World War as a bad war, the Second has come to be seen by contrast as a virtuous crusade against the Nazi architects of genocide.
Nobody went to war in 1939 to stop the Germans massacring the Jews. I mean, sad that maybe you've said that, partly because, of course, the serious massacres hadn't yet begun, but principally because Germany might be doing awful things, Nazi Germany, domestically, but in those days, nobody saw that as an obligation to go to war in the way in which we would today. So, in some respects, both wars break out for similar reasons. Great power rivalries and the concerns of the balance of power within Europe and what is happening within Eastern Europe. They're remarkably similar in their causation. And it is perverse that we have closed the Second World War as the good war and the First World War as the bad war.
The carnage from World War I is staggering. In France, out of a population of 40 million, the Great War killed at least 1.5 million souls, approximately 10% of the adult male population. Estimates are that for every dead man, there could have been 3 or 4 more wounded, maimed, or driven mad. In a time before accurate record keeping, who knows how many people simply vanished. Records don't take into account the scores who had their lives cut short after the war by the lingering effects of wounds, exposure to gas, and post-traumatic stress disorders. It was Stalin who once said, "One death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." The Great War sucked up billions of dollars. Governments went massively into debt. Some estimates put the Allied war costs at over $190 billion in 1918 dollars. On the Western Front, France, Britain, and Germany fought a stalemate in muddy trenches dug from Switzerland to the English Channel. In the East, the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires crumbled into chaos. The weapons born of the industrial era, machine guns, high explosives, tanks, airplanes, and poison gas, made combat more destructive and deadlier than ever before. The war destroyed more than just human lives. In 1919, a Red Cross official estimated that about 6,000 square miles of France had become, for all practical purposes, a wilderness, or roughly the equivalent of a strip 2 miles wide stretching from New York to San Francisco. The French government tallied 410,000 damaged or destroyed buildings. The medieval masterpiece of stained glass windows in the French cathedral at Reims was obliterated by artillery fire. Churches, villages, historic sites, they were all shelled without mercy. Around battlefields like the Somme and Verdun, no trees were left alive. Some hills were fought over so much that the tops had actually been blown off. Surveyors after the war measured hills that were 50 meters lower. The land recovered quickly, but to this day, French farmers continue to plow up shells, barbed wire, and bones. Poison gas was a terrifying new way to die. Artillery shells filled with gas landed on the trenches and spread green clouds over the battlefield. The gas collected in the trenches and drove soldiers out into exposed ground to be machine gunned or blown up. Movie cameras were new and cumbersome. There is moving footage of the war, but the overwhelming visual record is still photography. Still cameras were perfected and portable by 1914, and these graphic photographs, combined with period newspaper sketches and drawings, are disconcerting, providing a unique, up-close visual record of the war and its gruesome aftermath. Images like these force us to wonder how it all started and how it came to an end. Can modern people even fathom what it was really like? How did America even get involved in what began as a European conflict? The decades before the Great War were some of the most prosperous and peaceful Europe had ever known. There hadn't been a full-scale war involving all the major powers in 100 years. Across the Atlantic, the United States was just emerging as a global power. To celebrate this peace and progress, just 20 years before World War I, all of Europe came together as friends at the World's Fair in Chicago during the summer of 1893. Pictures from the fair show a world of peace, progress, exploration, and a future that could have been. People in Europe writing memoirs about the summer of 1914 remembered it as a beautiful summer. For the upper classes, it was one long holiday. For young people, it was a great time to be alive. The world was modern enough to be exciting. There were films, cars, records, and modern sanitation, but it was still comfortably slow-paced and old-fashioned. The romantic images of European life were real. A bit of bad news hit the papers in the summer of 1914. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Europe, and his wife Sophie were killed in the city of Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. By August, Europe's summer was over. America is and was a melting pot of cultures and religions, all under one flag. Europe was completely different. It was a complex mosaic of many different cultures nursing grievances. Beneath the years of peace was a growing nationalism and a growing distrust. After the murder of Franz Ferdinand, Austria demanded that Austrian agents be allowed to investigate the crime in Serbia itself. Serbia rejected the demand, and Austria declared war on Serbia on July 28th, then attacked Belgrade on the 29th. To make a long story short, Austria-Hungary was allied with Germany, and Serbia was allied with Russia. France was also allied with Russia. Russia would not tolerate a mobilized Austrian army on its border, and in return, mobilized its army against Austria. Germany ordered Russia to stop mobilizing, and when they refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st. Germans took to the streets and cheered. The insecure and unstable Kaiser Wilhelm II felt that Germany deserved a massive empire, that Germany was the most technologically advanced and mightiest country in Europe. Many Germans felt the same way he did. Historians have psychoanalyzed the Kaiser for decades. He was jealous of his cousin, King George V of England. He was related by marriage to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and they had appeared to be friends, referring to each other as Willie and Nicky. No matter what the reasons, Germany, he thought, did not have its rightful place in the sun. With one great war, they could end the threat from Russia and France forever. Boys and men were called into service by the thousands to serve the fatherland. They would destroy their foes and create a more powerful German empire. For years, they waited for Germany's opportunity. Der Tag, they called it. The day. The day when Germany would defeat all its enemies. On August 1st, 1914, Der Tag came. Germany declared war on Russia, and 2 days later declared war on France. On August 4th, Germany invaded Belgium with a massive army of men to take the war to the heart of France. 2 days after that, Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia. The German military general staff had developed a plan to win a war against France on one side and Russia on the other. They would invade France through Belgium and make a huge arc around Paris. France would surrender. Then the German army would turn around and head east against Russia. Germany would make their enemies pay for the war and annex huge chunks of Russia and France. Prior to the war, Britain, France, and Germany had all guaranteed Belgium's neutrality. Britain could never accept a German army next door to them across the English Channel. Once Germany invaded Belgium, that was it. The world was at war. Britain and its far-flung empire declared war on Germany on August 4th. Then Turkey came into the war on the German side. Then Italy on the Allied side. Then Bulgaria on the German side. Then Romania on the Allied side. The belligerents looked at the war as an opportunity to settle old scores, take territory, and make themselves secure forever. This war would finally end grudges on all sides that went back centuries. Meanwhile, the United States was the great neutral. With a population approaching 100 million people, Americans were busy enjoying a growing economy, Coca-Cola, motor cars, and baseball. At first, America stayed out of the war, but American industry provided a lot of the equipment and financing. In a time before television and the internet, Americans read newspapers which made the war seem very far away. In 1914, the war was very far away. Influential people like former President Theodore Roosevelt supported going to war, especially after a German submarine sank the luxury liner Lusitania on May 7, 1915, killing roughly 1,200 people, including more than 120 Americans. But Americans out in the heartland didn't know anybody who sailed on luxury ocean liners and weren't about to go to war for them. President Woodrow Wilson was re-elected in November 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Wilson offered to negotiate an end to the conflict. However, shortly after Wilson's election, the German government did two things that completely changed American attitudes in just 3 months. In January 1917, Germany declared unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship bringing supplies to Britain or France would be torpedoed. American merchant ships were now targets. German submarine attacks were a frightening new way of fighting. They attacked silently, with no warning, breaking the rules that had restricted naval warfare for 100 years. In a few weeks, 4 American ships were sunk with 15 dead. Another German move brought the war to America's front steps. They secretly offered to let Mexico take back Texas and U.S. territory in the Southwest if Mexico entered the war on the German side. The Germans sent the offer in a telegram to Mexico City, but British intelligence intercepted the message and gave it to the Americans in late February. Now the conflict had gotten much closer. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on Germany. England and France cheered. Tired from 3 years of battle, they were running out of men, out of food, out of everything. The Yanks were coming, and they would change the tide of the war. The United States slowly started building a 1 million-man American expeditionary force and moving it to Europe. Eventually, 2 million U.S. troops would serve overseas. America had never before fielded an army of this size. The newspapers nicknamed the AEF soldiers doughboys. Where the name comes from, nobody knows for sure. Some different theories say their uniform buttons looked like dough, or that the soldiers ate fried donuts, or that cavalry soldiers used the name to describe the dust-covered infantrymen. There are dozens of other theories. Regardless, the name stuck, and the doughboys shipped off to France. Many historians downplay the U.S. role in World War I because America didn't fight in the war for very long. By the end of 1917, elements of the U.S. Marines and the 1st Infantry Division were fighting alongside the Allies. But the AEF's full strength would not be tested in large-scale combat operations until the following spring. However, in 1918, neither side was winning. They were literally stuck in the mud, and it looked like the stalemate could go on for years.
Some men are getting married so they won't be called to war. But if they want to dodge it, what do they get married for? It takes about a year or more to train a soldier right. A year of married life will make them all know how to fight.
America entered, and the Allies won decisively by November of that year. The cost was high. In about a year of fighting, roughly 50,000 troops were killed in action, with more than 200,000 wounded. Taking diseases like the influenza epidemic into account, over 120,000 American soldiers died in the Great War. By comparison, in over 4 years of combat, nearly 300,000 American men died in World War II. In World War I, American soldiers died at an even faster rate than in the Civil War. If the United States had been in the war for 4 full years, 1 million troops could have died. World War I is the conflict that shaped the world we live in today. Communism, fascism, and much of the turmoil we live with in the 21st century all trace their roots back to the Great War. World War I destroyed the Ottoman Empire and created Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. It created a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The revolutionary Vladimir Lenin watched the Tsar fall and plotted the Bolshevik takeover of Russia. In the German trenches in Belgium, Corporal Adolf Hitler won decorations for bravery and dreamed of a 1,000-year German Reich. The Great War hurt Germany, destabilized its society, and wounded its pride, directly leading to World War II. The Great War affected America. We live with its impact on art, literature, music, race relations, and women's rights today. Even in language, expressions we use every day trace their roots to the war, like over the top and shell shock. Great changes in history are made by the actions of individual men and women. These are a few stories of those who fought the Great War and changed America. As early as 1914 and 1915, long before the United States officially entered the war, some Americans were already volunteering in France, driving ambulances, and even fighting in the French army. It was said that there were thousands of Americans volunteering before the declaration of war. Many of these volunteers were children of privilege from America's Ivy League universities. Not all of them were from Harvard, but they became famous as the Harvard Volunteers. Their letters and newspaper articles published throughout the U.S. publicized the suffering of the French, British, and Belgians. America belonged at their side, they believed, and idealistic young people would shame the U.S. into the war. Alan Seeger was one of those Harvard volunteers. He was an unlikely soldier. He was a poet out of Harvard. Along with his cultured New York family of musicians and writers, he had traveled the world as a young man. After graduating from Harvard in 1910, he wound up in Paris like so many hopeful artists looking for fun. Among the bohemians of the left bank, he lived a romantic life of wine, women, and song. Finding himself, we might say today. Something snapped in Seeger in 1914 when the Germans invaded France and advanced within a few miles of Paris. He wrote to his mother, Paris, to whom they owed the happiest moments of their lives. Paris was in peril. Without renouncing their nationality, they had yet chosen to make their homes here beyond any other city in the world. Did not the benefits and blessings they had received point them a duty that heart and conscience could not deny? Seeger had found his purpose. He joined the French Foreign Legion within a month of the invasion. Among the Americans who volunteered, Seeger was unique. Many of his American compatriots soon grew sick of life in the trenches and left for the more comfortable but still dangerous life as airplane pilots. Yet, Seeger stayed in the trenches. A brilliant writer, his letters to the New York papers were the closest look that Americans got of the war. One reads, "The poor common soldier's role is simply to dig himself a hole in the ground and to keep hidden in it as tightly as possible. Continually under the fire of the opposing batteries, he is never allowed to get a glimpse of the enemy. He is condemned to sit like an animal in his burrow, hearing the shells whistle over his head and taking their daily toll from his comrades." Seeger felt a spiritual bond with the common French soldiers and the suffering French people. He described for American readers the fatalistic, almost suicidal reaction of the French people to the thousands of lives lost to defend France. "Come to love France," he wrote to his mother, "and understand the almost unexampled nobility of the effort this admirable people is making, for that will be the surest way of your finding comfort for anything I am ready to suffer in their cause." Some unnameable feeling kept Seeger in the trenches. He seemed to enjoy the war. Combat stripped away the veneer of a cultured man and left an ancient warrior. In all its horror, the war allowed modern men to feel a power they had never known. Seeger described hearing a scream at night on the battlefield. He wrote, "In that cry, all the evolution of the centuries was leveled. I seemed to hear the yell of the warrior of the Stone Age over his fallen enemy." It was one of those antidotes to civilization this war can offer so many seekers after extraordinary sensations. An attack of bronchitis in March 1916 gave Seeger a month's leave in his beloved Paris. "I lived," Seeger wrote of that month, "as though I were saying goodbye to life." On July 4th, 1916, he was back in the muddy trenches in northern France. Seeger wasn't even supposed to be in the trenches that day. A group of American volunteers were having a 4th of July celebration in Paris, and Seeger had been granted leave to go, but the paperwork never made it to his unit. Instead, he was awaiting an order for his unit to go over the top and attack the German trenches in front of them. The fighting was the French part of the Battle of the Somme. West of where Seeger was, the British Army had attacked the Germans 3 days before, and 20,000 British soldiers died in a single day. Now it was France's turn. French artillery pounded the German trenches for days. Seeger was excited. He wrote before the battle that, "I am glad to be going in the first wave. If you are in this thing at all, it is best to be in it to the limit, and this is the supreme experience." The artillery guns stopped, and Seeger heard machine guns firing to the left. The order came to attack. Seeger climbed the ladder out of the trench and started running toward the German lines. Over there, most of the Germans had survived the bombardment. They climbed out of bunkers and manned machine guns. French soldiers ran at them with rifles and bayonets, and the German machine guns cut them down like wheat at harvest time. Seeger was hit in the chest with a machine gun round. He spun and hit the ground, but he didn't die right away. French soldiers who survived told the story of how he cheered on the soldiers coming up behind him. They found his body on the battlefield the next day, along with hundreds of others. He was buried where he fell. The French government posthumously awarded Seeger the Croix de Guerre, France's decoration for acts of heroism. Seeger's first book of poems was published the year he died. His best-known poem, Rendezvous, was an eerie prediction. The first verse reads, "I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death when spring brings back blue days and fair." In 1903, the Wright brothers flew the first motorized airplane at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Airplane development continued, and flying was considered new, exciting, and romantic. At the beginning of the Great War, planes were first used for observation, along with balloons and hydrogen-filled zeppelins. No one had thought of observation planes attacking each other. There was a legend that the first observer pilots who encountered each other in midair saluted. The next time they met, they shook their fists. Then they threw rocks. The next time they shot with pistols and quickly moved on to rifles and machine guns. In 1914, both sides were ready to use any technological development as a weapon, and the Great War is famous for its many innovations, like flamethrowers, hand grenades, and tanks, industrial-age weapons perfected to kill people. Airplanes were no exception, as they quickly turned from an instrument of romance and excitement to an instrument of death and destruction. By the end of World War I in 1918, airplanes had developed to the point of escorting ship convoys, performing strategic reconnaissance, landing on aircraft carriers, bombing cities, and dogfighting. German Zeppelins bombed London in May 1915 and Paris in January 1916. People were terrified, and newspapers ran drawings depicting an apocalyptic German invasion with balloons and airplanes. The slow-moving Zeppelins and balloons were primarily giant observation platforms used to aid the artillery, and airplanes were quickly being employed to attack them. On June 17, 1915, a French plane brought down a hydrogen-filled Zeppelin with a bomb dropped from above. Now planes with weapons went up to escort the observer balloons. By the autumn of 1915, the escort planes were patrolling and attacking each other. Airplane development moved rapidly for the rest of the war. Each month brought faster, more maneuverable fighters and bombers carrying heavier bombs. State-of-the-art planes would be obsolete within months, assuming they even lasted that long. By the end of the war, planes coordinated with ground attacks. They could fly low to strafe trenches with machine gun fire and accurately drop bombs into them. Before 1914, airplanes took awestruck passengers into a beautiful new world far above the squabbles of the earth. 4 years later, they were just one more weapon used to kill people. On the ground, in no man's land, soldiers crawled through trenches, machine-gunned and bombed faceless enemies. It was described as a living hell. Anonymous dead were buried in common graves. The generals looked like butchers, the men cattle.
Uncle Sam will show the way over the line and across the
In contrast, the pilots were knights in shining armor. Flying was so popular that German kids collected trading cards with German flying aces on them, like the Red Baron.
It's a long way to Berlin, but we'll get there.
In the spring of 1916, the most famous Americans fighting in France were the pilots of the Lafayette Escadrille, the American squadron in the French Army. A group of American Ivy League volunteers had joined the French Foreign Legion early in the war. But unlike Seeger, they quickly grew tired of life in the squalid trenches. Using their connections to pull strings in the French and American governments, 7 men got permission to form an all-American squadron of flyers under French command. Reporters loved the Lafayette Escadrille. Newspapers in America glamorized their adventures. As its fame grew, many new men joined. They even had a pet lion named Whiskey, who was later joined by another pet lion appropriately named Soda. Pilots were but a minuscule part of the fighting men, but they were indispensable for observation, and as the war dragged on, they became invaluable for propaganda. The public was fed stories about the exploits of the dashing young men in the skies, rather than the bad news from the trenches. Of course, in 1916, it was also a fun time to be in the Lafayette Escadrille. They had their own base, where unlike other soldiers, they enjoyed hot baths, beds, good food, and pretty French girls. But they were no safer than anyone else. Before a mission, officers lined up small boxes containing Croix de Guerre medals, all ready to be sent to the families of pilots who didn't return. By the time regular American Army pilots began flying in France in the spring of 1918, 4 of the original 7 American Lafayette Escadrille pilots were dead. The survivors became the nucleus for training famous flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker and the rest of America's new Air Force. Victor Chapman was one of the biggest celebrities in the Lafayette Escadrille. He was another young Harvard man, studying architecture at the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He spent nearly a year in the French Foreign Legion before becoming one of the original 7 men in the squadron. Chapman didn't fit the image of a Harvard man or an artist. He was a big, powerful man who barely fit into the cockpit of the French-made Nieuport fighter planes. His father wrote of him, "He could eat anything, sleep on anything, lift anything, endure anything." Chapman lived to fly. His father said if you could place him in a position of danger and let him watch scenery, he was in heaven. I don't think he was ever completely happy until the day he got his flying papers. Flying as the co-pilot on bombing and reconnaissance missions over German lines gave Chapman plenty of opportunity for danger and scenery. Like Seeger, he thrived on fighting. Chapman won a dogfight over the tremendous Battle of Verdun. His letters about the engagement read like an action novel. On the way back, I saw another fat Boche. I swooped. I swerved to the right, almost lost, but came up under his lee keel by the stern, the one position they can't shoot from. I seemed a dory alongside a schooner. I pulled my nose up to let him have it. A cartridge jammed in the barrel. He jumped like a frog and fled down to his grounds behind German lines. Chapman's flying skill and bravery were remarkable. After a fight with 4 German planes, he made an emergency landing in a bullet-riddled plane with a broken stabilizing rod. Grazed by a bullet in the scalp, he held the broken rod together with one hand and steered the plane with the other. After bandaging his head, he went straight back into combat. On June 23, 1916, a few days after that landing, Chapman tagged along with a combat patrol on an errand to deliver oranges to a wounded comrade on another base. When they crossed German lines, the patrol went on its mission and Chapman waved to his friends and continued on his errand. The patrol became engaged with 2 German planes. Suddenly, 3 other German planes closed in behind them. It was an ambush. The Americans had no hope. From out of the sunlight, a Nieuport appeared and dove straight into the German formation. It was Chapman. 2 German planes went down immediately. The 3 other German planes went after Chapman and disappeared over enemy lines. The rest of the patrol made it safely back to base. Victor Chapman's plane went down somewhere behind German lines, riddled with machine gun fire from 3 German fighters. The Germans who found him probably wondered about the basket of oranges in the cockpit. He was the first American pilot to die in the Lafayette Escadrille. The French army sent his family the Croix de Guerre that had been waiting for him in its little box. No one beat the drum for America to go to war harder than Theodore Roosevelt. From August 1914, he thundered in speeches and articles around the country that the United States belonged in the war on the side of France and Britain. Roosevelt was the Republican vice president in 1901 and became president when William McKinley was assassinated. He was 42, the youngest president ever, and one of the most energetic. A Spanish-American war hero, he was famous for the Rough Riders and established the national park system. The country was infatuated with him and his 4 precocious sons, Ted, Kermit, Archie, and Quentin. After 2 terms, he left the White House in 1909. In 1912, Teddy Roosevelt ran for president again as the candidate of his own Bull Moose Party and split the Republican vote. Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the White House. In 1917, Roosevelt was still the most popular politician in America and one of the best-known Americans in the world. He despised Woodrow Wilson for keeping the country neutral and called him a coward. He claimed that America's honor and interests were at stake. In fact, it could be said Roosevelt cared so much that he put his dynasty on the line. The Great War era was a different time in many ways. In World War I, the sons of the politicians fought and their daughters and wives volunteered behind the lines. Men like Ulysses Grant's grandson, J.E.P. Morgan, the son of J.P. Morgan, Charles Taft, the son of President Taft, and George Pickett, the grandson of Confederate General George Pickett, among others, served. The wives of senators met to sew for soldiers abroad. All 4 of Teddy Roosevelt's sons volunteered to fight. Archie was wounded 3 times and won France's Croix de Guerre. Quentin Roosevelt was Teddy's youngest son. Of Quentin Roosevelt, it was said that he's an awfully nice fellow and a beautiful flyer. Quentin didn't receive special treatment. Like all the airmen, he He went through a year of flying, maneuvering, and gunnery lessons before he went into combat in June 1918. The July 19th issue of Stars and Stripes, under the headline, "American Flyers Get First Chance in Real Big Show," told Quentin's story. Our Chasse squadrons, which heretofore had confined themselves to air fighting, were instructed to fly low and harass enemy troops with machine gun fire. Lieutenant Roosevelt was flying with a patrol of 5, from which he became separated. He saw 2 machines and, believing them to be part of his group, flew to join them. As he neared them, he discovered they were Germans and attacked immediately. They separated, and he pursued one to a point 25 kilometers behind the German lines, where he saw it going down in smoke and flames. But the Stars and Stripes article continued with the blunt truth. Early Sunday morning, July 14th, Lieutenant Roosevelt went out with his squadron and did not return. When the Germans found his plane and realized from the newspapers that this was the son of a president, they buried him with full military honors. When the Americans pushed the Germans out of the area, they found the grave. The Germans had made a cross over the grave out of wood from the airplane. Father Duffy blessed the grave. In his story of the war, Duffy wrote, "We erected our own little monument without molesting the one that had been left by the Germans. It is fitting that enemy and friend alike should pay tribute to heroism." Stars and Stripes said of Quentin's death that his loss was quickly avenged. But for Theodore Roosevelt, no vengeance could heal the hole in his heart. Teddy Roosevelt died the following January. Most American volunteers in France worked on the ground, far beneath the glamour of the Lafayette Escadrille. They were not soldiers, but helped wounded Allied troops as ambulance drivers. The best-known group was the American Ambulance Field Service. Like the volunteer soldiers, many of the ambulance drivers were idealistic young men from America's elite universities seeking adventure. One of the most popular drivers was Richard Hall. Fresh out of Dartmouth in June 1915, he headed immediately for France and was driving an ambulance within a month in Alsace, in the mountains where the borders of France, Germany, and Switzerland meet. Every day, Hall drove through this surreal, mystic landscape along winding roads filled with French wounded, German prisoners, and broken-down artillery wagons. Reaching the front lines in the dark, Hall filled his truck with bleeding French soldiers, bundled in blankets, and drove back down the hills to the hospital. After he dropped off the men, he turned around and went back to pick up more. Late at night on Christmas Eve, 1915, he headed up the mountain again. For Hall, Christmas meant 2 lonely hours bumping along tire ruts through a nightmare landscape. No one knows if Hall lived long enough to see Christmas morning. The next driver up the mountain found him still holding the wheel, looking like he was asleep. A splinter from a German shell had pierced his skull. Hall was awarded the Croix de Guerre and buried in a French military cemetery. His citation read, "Barely graduated from Dartmouth College, and the noble enthusiasms of his youth, he brought to France the invaluable cooperation of his charitable heart." National Guard units were among the first troops to fight in France. State National Guards went into action. Towns, counties, and neighborhoods volunteered together. The most famous National Guard unit, and probably the most famous regiment of the war, was the 69th New York Infantry Regiment, New York City's Fighting Irish. The regiment had fought at Antietam and other bloody battles of the Civil War, and never let anyone forget their history. The Fighting Irish were colorful, proud, and boastful. Nobody could outfight, outsing, outtalk, or outdrink the Fighting 69th. Few units could outright them. The unit and its followers boasted a number of talented writers who made sure that their exploits were never out of the New York City newspapers. The Fighting Irish weren't all Irish. One writer called them Irish by adoption, Irish by association, or Irish by conviction. The men came from across the spectrum of New York life. Italians, Slavs, Germans. There was a Choctaw Indian named McCoy, but no African Americans. The 69th was segregated like the rest of the U.S. Army. Though the men of the 69th were great boasters, the exploits of the regiment were not all boasting. The regiment was fighting with heavy losses in the Argonne Forest right up to the armistice. Of the 3,000-some men who had left New York, all but 600 were dead or wounded at the end of the war. One reminder of the Fighting Irish still stands in Manhattan's Times Square. In the middle of the giant television screens, high-tech advertising displays, and never-ending bustle, sits a statue that doesn't quite fit the modern scene. In front of a massive stone Celtic cross stands a massive stone Celtic man. In his hands, he grips a Bible the way a man might grip a gun. It takes a while to realize that he's a Catholic priest. Father Francis P. Duffy was the chaplain of the Fighting Irish. Duffy believed that Jesus was a peacemaker, but a tough one. Carrying only his Bible and sacraments, Duffy came unscathed through frontline fighting, tending the wounded and giving the last rites to men dying all around him. Duffy never touched a gun, but the French government awarded him the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. He was the heart of the Fighting 69th. He was the historian and chronicler of the regiment and wrote some of the best descriptions of combat to come out of the war. Murderous and futile infantry charges against machine guns, mortars, and barbed wire were an unfortunate part of the common experience of British, French, German, Russian, American, and all other soldiers in the war. Father Duffy described the brutal, surreal experience that pointlessly killed so many on all sides. He wrote, "There is no tougher experience than that of advancing over a considerable distance under fire. The trouble is that the men are being shot down by an enemy whom they cannot see. They reply with their rifles and machine guns, but they have only the vaguest hope that they are accomplishing anything more than disconcerting their opponents. When a soldier gets where he can see the foe, he develops a sort of hunter's exhilaration. His blood warms up and he actually forgets that the other fellow is shooting at him. Advancing in the open against trenches, he has only the sensations of the hunted. Heavy fire begins to rain down around them. Men are hit. The line drops. Each man in whatever shelter he can find. Then the order is given to rise and go forward again. Spurts of dust are kicked up. The first 3 or 4 men to advance walk into the line of bullets and go down before they have gone 10 feet. And the others who have seen them fall must go straight ahead and take that same deadly chance, never knowing when they themselves will stop a German missile. One of the creepiest feelings in war is that of being boxed in by artillery fire. A shell lands to the right of a group of men, no harm in that, all safe. Then one lands to the left, to the front or rear, and the next is closer in between them. Then everybody knows what is happening. That square is in for a shelling until nothing inside it will escape except by a miracle. One officer in the 69th came through so many fights that he seemed almost superhuman. His name was William J. Donovan. He was known as Wild Bill. Donovan grew up working class in Buffalo, New York, and played quarterback for Columbia University's football team. He joined the New York National Guard, served on the Mexican border, and rose fast in the ranks. He was a major in command of the 1st Battalion of the Fighting 69th by the time they reached France. Men were in awe of Donovan in combat. He displayed no fear. Most majors directed the battalion from a safe distance behind, but Donovan stayed at the front line. German snipers a mile away could see he was an officer. Donovan drove his men hard, but whatever they faced, he faced. Father Duffy wrote that Donovan is one of the few men I know who really enjoys a battle. Father Duffy and the 69th were in the middle of some of the bloodiest combat that the American Army fought in France. Only a few weeks before the armistice was announced, the 69th was thrown against a strong German position in the Argonne Forest on the border between France and Belgium. The regiment gained 3 kilometers of ground at a terrible cost. They attacked against dug-in Germans and barbed wire without any artillery preparation. Father Duffy described the slaughter. The battalion fought its way right up to the enemy's wire, only to find it an impassable barrier. Our artillery fire had not made a break in it anywhere. Groups of our lads dashed up to the wire only to be shot down to the last man. Some ran through a passage made for the roadway, but this, of course, was absolutely covered by the German guns, and every man that went through was shot, and if not killed outright, taken prisoner. Soldiers of ours and of the engineers with wire-cutting tools lay on their faces working madly to cut through the strands, while riflemen and grenadiers alongside of them tried to beat down the resistance. But they were in a perfect hail of bullets from front and flank, and every last man was killed or wounded. Further back was a concentration of artillery fire, of bursting shells and groans and death that made the advance of the support platoons a veritable hell. Wild Bill's amazing luck held up almost to the end of the war. In the Argonne, he took a bullet that shattered his knee. He refused to be evacuated while his battalion was still fighting. He spent 5 hours directing the battle from a shell hole while German artillery rained down all around him. When Donovan was finally being carried to an aid station, he came across Father Duffy. Duffy recorded in his memoir that Wild Bill smiled from the stretcher and said, "Father, you're a disappointed man. You expected to have the pleasure of burying me over here." Father Duffy was a fervent admirer of heroism, but the experience of the Argonne changed him. He wrote, "Nobody wants to talk very much about the recent battle. It was a nightmare that one does not care to recall. Individual acts of heroism do not stand out in actions of this kind. It is a case of everybody going ahead and taking the punishment." Father Duffy broke down crying at the announcement of the armistice. "All day I had a lonely and an aching heart," he wrote. "I could think of nothing but the fine lads who are not alive to enjoy the triumph." His feelings, he said, lay in the past. Back at home, the 69th was cheered on as they marched through the Victory Arch on Fifth Avenue. Duffy became the center of Catholic and democratic New York, fought for social programs for the poor, and helped deliver the vote that elected New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the White House. Donovan became President Roosevelt's personal spy. After Pearl Harbor, he helped to organize the Office of Strategic Services that helped the U.S. win World War II. Donovan's spy network stayed in place when the Cold War began, and the CIA was born. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. The quote is so familiar that it is often used as a joke. Next to Hamlet's "to be or not to be," it might be the best-known line in the English language. Some people know that the poet's name was Joyce Kilmer. Some of those people know that Joyce was a man, not a woman. Not many know that Joyce Kilmer was a war hero in the Fighting 69th. In 1917, Joyce Kilmer was probably the best-known journalist in New York and was the great book reviewer of his time. His book of poems, Trees, was published in 1914 to glowing reviews and publicity. He was in demand as a speaker all over the country. But something was missing for Joyce Kilmer. His busy social life, hundreds of friends, growing family, and loving wife Aileen didn't quite satisfy a yearning for adventure, a yearning to prove himself. He was obsessed by a vision of romantic, righteous combat. When the Germans sunk the ocean liner Lusitania in 1915, a slow burn started inside Kilmer. Kilmer delighted in seeing himself as an Irish warrior. The truth is, he was hardly Irish. He was one of the Irish by conviction. The Fighting 69th turned the Great War into an Irish war, and Kilmer was not going to miss an Irish war. "I delight in hopes that are vain," he wrote. 3 weeks after the United States declared war, Kilmer joined the Army as a private and finagled his way into the 165th Infantry, the new designation the Army had given the Fighting 69th. The fighting was a religious act for Kilmer, a devout Catholic. This is a poem he wrote about the regiment. "Romantic Ireland is not old. For years untold her youth will shine. Her heart is fed on heavenly bread. The blood of martyrs is her wine." Arriving in France, Kilmer wrote on a postcard, "Nice war, nice people, nice country, nice everything." After being stuck with clerical jobs, he turned down a promotion to be a sergeant in the intelligence section of the regiment. The front was his goal, a fellow soldier told the New York Times, and no sooner had he reached France than he made every possible effort to be transferred. Intelligence was one of the most dangerous jobs in the field. Kilmer had a very simple task: to find out how many Germans are out there, where their machine guns are, where the barbed wire is, and how far they are dug in. The only way to find out was to crawl out under the barbed wire